Get your black ass back in that seat before I drag you there myself, old man." The words ripped through courtroom number 4 of the Winston Hill District Courthouse like a blade drawn across silk, clean and vicious and impossible to unhear. Every head turned, every breath caught. And the man who spoke them, Lieutenant Wade Hargrave, stood in the center aisle with his chest inflated and his jaw locked tight as though he had just restored order to a universe that had briefly tilted out of his control. What he didn't know was that someone in the last row was watching everything unfold silent and still, and that someone was the old man's son, an FBI special agent whose patience was a weapon no badge could stop. What happens when a man who thinks he is untouchable strikes the one person connected to the only force he cannot outrun? Stay until the end to find out. But first you need to understand the room where it happened, because rooms like this one have a way of shaping the violence that occurs inside them, the way a mold shapes what is poured into it. The Winston Hill District Courthouse sat on the corner of Beauregard Avenue and 3rd Street, in a town that time had not forgotten, but had certainly stopped rushing toward. The building was old, built in the 1930s with federal money and local pride, and both of those things had faded at roughly the same pace. The limestone facade had darkened to the color of a bruise. The front steps were cracked in 3 places, patched once with cement that didn't match, then left alone to weather on their own. Inside the hallways smelled of wood polish applied too infrequently, and industrial floor cleaner applied too often, and somewhere beneath both of those scents was the older, deeper smell of paper, of ink, of decisions recorded and filed and forgotten in rooms where fluorescent lights buzzed with a frequency that felt like it was slowly drilling into the base of your skull. Courtroom number 4 was at the end of the second-floor hallway past a water fountain that produced a thin, warm trickle, and a bulletin board pinned with notices so old their edges had curled inward like dried leaves. The room itself was rectangular with high ceilings that amplified every cough and shuffle wooden benches worn smooth by decades of anxious hands, and a ceiling fan that rotated with a mechanical groan so persistent it had become part of the room's identity. The kind of sound that marked time more than cooled anything. The fluorescent tubes overhead flickered every few minutes, casting brief stutters of shadow across the gallery that made people blink and look up as though the building itself were trying to get their attention. On this particular Wednesday morning in late October, the docket was light. A noise complaint from the East Side. A zoning dispute between a barbershop owner and the city. And at 10:15, case number 47-219. A civil boundary dispute involving a 74-year-old black man named Elijah Daniels, whose neighbor had moved a fence line 18 inches onto his property and refused to move it back. Small, undramatic, the kind of case that barely justified the gas it took to drive to the courthouse. And that was precisely what made everything that followed feel so disproportionate, so impossibly cruel. Because the violence that erupted in this room did not come from a murder trial or a gang prosecution or anything that might have generated the kind of tension that leads men to lose control. It came from an old man standing up. The gallery held fewer than 20 people that morning. In the second row sat Gerald and Donna Pace, a retired white couple in their early 70s, who came to the courthouse every Wednesday, the way other couples went to the movies, because it gave them something to talk about over lunch. Donna was knitting something yellow. Gerald had a folded newspaper on his knee and a pen behind his ear as though he might be called upon to take notes at any moment. 3 rows back, a young black mother named Shonda Williams sat with a toddler balanced on her left knee and a diaper bag taking up the seat beside her, waiting for her own case to be called, a child custody modification that her lawyer had told her would take 15 minutes, but that she suspected would take the rest of her morning. The toddler, a boy with enormous brown eyes and a fistful of animal crackers, was remarkably quiet, as though he understood at some level that this was not a place for noise. Near the side wall, a courthouse reporter named Helen Marsh sat with a spiral notebook open on her lap, her pen moving in slow, automatic loops that were more doodle than shorthand. Helen had covered Winston Hill proceedings for 11 years, and had long since stopped expecting anything in this courtroom to surprise her. Behind her, leaning against the back wall with his arms folded across a gray maintenance uniform, was a man named Curtis, who spent his breaks watching cases the way some men watch pigeons in the park, with a detached, mildly philosophical interest in the patterns of human behavior. The judge presiding that morning was the Honorable Richard Kessler, a man in his late 60s whose face had the permanent flush of someone who spent too much time in overheated rooms. He wore bifocals that he adjusted constantly, pushing them up his nose with one finger, in a gesture so habitual it had become a kind of punctuation. Judge Kessler was not a bad man. He was not corrupt, not malicious, not even particularly biased in the ways that mattered on paper. He was something arguably worse. He was indifferent. He had let his courtroom run on autopilot for so many years that the machinery of justice had become for him merely machinery, something that hummed and processed without requiring his moral engagement. He shuffled papers. He signed where indicated. He sustained and overruled with the detached efficiency of a man stamping tickets at a toll booth. And on this morning, he did not look up when the old man in the navy blazer reached into his coat pocket and touched, with the tips of 2 fingers, the folded edge of a white cotton handkerchief. The handkerchief was old. It had been white once in the way that new things are white, bright and certain, but years of washing and folding and carrying had turned it into something gentler, a shade closer to cream to memory. In one corner, embroidered in thread that had once been navy blue, but had faded to a color between smoke and sky, were 2 initials, R.D., Ruth Daniels. Elijah's wife of 49 years dead now, for 3, buried in the cemetery behind Mount Olive Baptist Church, in a plot that Elijah visited every Sunday after service, rain or shine, kneeling on the grass to pull weeds from around her headstone and tell her about the week. He touched the handkerchief the way a man touches a talisman before entering a place where he knows the world might test him, not because he expected a fight, but because the feel of that fabric against his fingertips reminded him that he had survived worse than whatever this morning intended to bring. He did not know, as he stood in that courtroom adjusting his reading glasses and preparing to address the judge about 18 inches of misplaced fence, that the handkerchief would soon be stained with his own blood. Elijah Amos Daniels was 74 years old, and his body carried every one of those years the way old timber carries weather, not with fragility, but with the dense, seasoned weight of something that has stood through storms and settled into its own permanence. His skin was dark, a deep umber that decades of southern sun had creased and polished into something that looked almost carved. His hair was silver-white cropped close to his skull. His hands were large scarred across the knuckles from 46 years of carpentry of shaping wood into cabinets and bookshelves and window frames for people whose names he wrote down in a leather notebook, because he believed that the people who trusted you with their homes deserved to be remembered by name. He wore his navy blazer, the one he reserved for church and courthouse. Beneath it, a white shirt buttoned to the collar without a tie. On his feet, shoes polished that morning with the same brush and tin of kiwi wax that had sat on his bedroom dresser since before his wife died, positioned in exactly the same spot she had always kept them. His reading glasses hung from a thin silver chain around his neck, a gift from his son years ago, practical and without sentiment in the way his son gave most gifts, as though affection were a code best communicated through usefulness. He rose from his seat, settling the glasses onto his nose with 2 fingers, and in that single motion, something in the room shifted. It was not a sound. It was more like a change in atmospheric pressure, the way the air feels different in the seconds before a thunderstorm, when the clouds haven't opened, but every living thing within range has already begun to brace. Elijah Daniels stood up. That was all. He straightened his spine into the posture that had been drilled into him by his father and reinforced by the United States Army and maintained every day since through sheer refusal to shrink and face the judge's bench. His back was straight, not rigid, not performative. It was the posture of a man who had learned through repetition and pain and the slow accumulation of indignities that no single incident could fully represent, that standing tall was not about pride. pride had long been ground into something more durable in Elijah Daniels, something closer to discipline, closer to a promise he had made to himself when he was young and had kept every day since. Some men never forget the lesson that standing tall matters most when everyone around you is trying to make you small. Lieutenant Wade Hargrave noticed. He always noticed when the wrong kind of people took up space. He was 47 years old, platinum blonde buzz cut so close to the scalp it was almost white jaw, permanently clenched, badge polished to a mirror shine that threw cold flashes in the fluorescent light. His uniform was starched to a stiffness that looked almost architectural, and he wore his duty belt low on his hips, heavy with equipment he rarely needed and frequently touched not for use but for reassurance. Hargrave had been with the Winston Hill Police Department for 14 years, transferred from a larger jurisdiction under circumstances that his personnel file described as a lateral move for professional development, and that the officers who had worked with him described when they described it at all with a shrug and a change of subject. He liked things in order. He liked compliance. He liked the specific silence that fell over a room when he positioned himself in it with his arms crossed. The silence that meant people had noticed him and had decided that whatever they had been about to do was no longer worth the risk. And now he watched Elijah Daniels stand. He watched the old man straighten his spine and adjust his glasses and face the bench with a composure that should not have been threatening, but that Wade Hargrave received the way a guard dog receives the sound of a gate opening when no one was expected. An elderly black man was standing tall in a room where Wade had spent years ensuring that everyone understood the hierarchy. And that man was not hunched, not deferential, not performing the particular brand of smallness that Wade had been trained by culture and repetition and the invisible curriculum of American power to expect. Wade's boots shifted on the hardwood. His arms unfolded. His right hand moved to his duty belt and rested there, fingers curling around nothing in particular, just touching the leather, the metal, the weight. He began walking toward the old man, not because he had been called, not because there was a disturbance, not because any protocol justified intervention in the peaceful act of a civilian standing to address a judge. He walked because the room had shifted, and in Wade Hargrave's world, when the room shifted, it was his job to shift it back. Wade crossed the courtroom floor in 7 steps. Each one landed heavier than it needed to the hard leather soles of his duty boots, striking the old hardwood with a deliberate percussion that turned heads before his voice did. Elijah had just opened his mouth to address Judge Kessler. His reading glasses were positioned on the bridge of his nose. His hands held a single sheet of paper, a surveyor's diagram showing the fence line and the property boundary. And his posture was that of a man who had rehearsed what he wanted to say in his kitchen that morning, while the coffee brewed, going over the words until they felt right, respectful but firm, clear, but not aggressive. He never got the first word out. I said, "Sit down." Wade's voice arrived before the rest of him, sharp and public and stripped of any pretense of professional restraint. He was close now, close enough that Elijah could smell the coffee on his breath and the chemical tang of starch. "You don't get up without permission. You understand me. You wait until you're called," Officer Elijah said, and his voice was steady, unhurried, the kind of voice that old wood would have if it could speak. "I was asked to present my documentation to the court." You're simply nothing." Wade stepped closer. The distance between them was now less than 2 feet. "You sit when I tell you to sit. You stand when I tell you to stand. This is my courtroom." It was not his courtroom. It was Judge Kessler's courtroom, and before that it had been the county's, and before that it had been built with the implicit promise that any citizen could stand in it and be heard. But Wade Hargrave had spent 14 years treating every room like his personal territory, and no one, not the judge, not the clerks, not the rotating cast of attorneys, had ever corrected him. They had looked away. They had let it slide. They had told themselves that Wade was just intense, just old school, and in doing so they had built a stage on which this moment was not just possible but inevitable. "I don't want trouble," Officer Elijah said. His feet remained exactly where they were planted, the way fence posts are planted, not aggressively, but with the quiet assertion that this ground is occupied. I just want to show the judge my property line. Wade's face changed. The professional mask dissolved entirely, and what replaced it was something older and uglier, a contempt so practiced it had become a physical expression. "You people," he said, and the words carried across the courtroom with the clarity of a church bell. In an empty field, always got something to show. Always got some paper, some excuse, some reason you think you belong somewhere you don't. This is not your house, old man. This is not your church, and that bench up there is not your friend. No one spoke. Donna's knitting needles stopped. Gerald's newspaper sat untouched. Shonda pulled her toddler closer, one hand cradling the back of his head. Helen's pen hovered in the air, and Curtis at the back wall shifted his weight and gripped his mop handle the way a man grips something when his body is preparing for a shock his mind hasn't fully processed. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. But time in moments like this one stretches. Every person in that courtroom saw Wade's right hand leave his duty belt rise to the height of his shoulder and swing forward with a speed and force that was not defensive, not reactive, not the measured response of a trained officer managing a threat. It was the motion of a man who had struck before and had always walked away. A reflex practiced 100 times, but never punished. The crack of palm on flesh rang through courtroom number 4 like a judge's gavel brought down on something that could never be repaired. Elijah's head snapped to the right. His reading glasses flew from his nose, catching the overhead light as they tumbled and landed on the floor 3 feet away with a sound like a small bone breaking. A thin arc of blood from his split lower lip traced a cruel line across the air and spattered onto the lenses, where they lay a single drop landing near the center of the right lens like a target, like an accusation. Like a period at the end of a sentence the world had been writing for 400 years. Elijah's feet did not move. His body absorbed the impact the way a wall absorbs a fist, firm, unyielding, giving nothing back. His head had turned with the slap, but his spine remained straight, his shoulders level. A sound escaped his mouth, not a cry, not a word, just the involuntary exhalation of a man whose body has been struck, but whose spirit has refused to acknowledge the injury as anything other than what it is proof. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of recognition. Every person knew what they had witnessed, and every person made a decision about what to do with that knowledge. Donna looked down at her knitting. Gerald folded his newspaper. Shonda pressed her face against her toddler's hair and closed her eyes. Helen's pen descended to the notebook but did not write. And Curtis gripped his mop handle so hard the wooden shaft creaked, but he did not move, did not speak, because he had learned the way. All of them had learned that speaking out gets you nowhere and looking away gets you home in one piece. One person moved. Shonda Williams, with her toddler on her hip and her eyes wide with a fear that was not for herself, raised her phone just high enough to clear the pew in front of her and pressed the record button. Her hand trembled. The camera shook. But the lens captured what happened next with the unblinking clarity that only a witness too afraid to look away can provide. Elijah reached into his coat pocket. His fingers found the handkerchief by touch, the familiar softness of the fabric, the slight ridge of the embroidered initials beneath his thumb. He pulled it out, unfolded it once, and dabbed at the corner of his mouth with a precision that was almost surgical, more concerned with the stain on the cloth than the blood on his lip, as though the handkerchief bearing his dead wife's initials deserved more protection than his own skin. He dabbed once, twice. Then he folded the cloth into a neat square and returned it to his pocket. Then he looked down at his glasses. The drop of blood sat on the right lens, round and dark and undeniable. He bent, slowly, picked them up, and placed them back on his nose without cleaning them. The blood stayed where it had landed. He let it sit. Not because he was too proud to wipe it away, but because some stains are evidence, and Elijah Daniels, son of a sharecropper, grandson of a man who had been born into ownership, had learned before he could read that when the world draws blood, you do not clean it up for them. You let them see what they have done. Wade stood where he had swung, breathing through his nose with the measured satisfaction of a man who believes he has just corrected an imbalance in the natural order. He wiped his palm on his uniform, a slow, deliberate gesture, as though the touch of Elijah's skin had left something that needed removing. "Should have stayed seated," he muttered, not quietly, at a volume calibrated to reach every ear in the gallery. Then he turned his back and walked to his post with the unhurried stride of a man who has reminded the world of its place and expects the world to thank him for it. No one stopped him. Not the judge who adjusted his bifocals and looked down at his papers. Not the bailiff who stood near the jury box with his hands at his sides and his mouth open and no sound coming out. Not the machinery of justice that was built to protect men like Elijah Daniels from men like Wade Hargrave, but that had been converted quietly and over many years into something that protected itself and the men it recognized as its own. And then, from the very last row, a man stood. He did not make a sound. He simply rose the way a shadow rises when the light shifts with a smoothness that suggested he had been preparing for this movement for a long time. Perhaps since before the slap. Perhaps since a night decades ago when he was a boy and had seen bruises on his father's arms that were never explained and never needed to be. He was taller than Wade by several inches. Dark suit without a tie charcoal fabric that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. His face was still. Not blank, but still in the way that deep water is still the surface revealing nothing about the currents beneath. His eyes were not looking at Wade. They were looking at the old man in the navy blazer, at the blood on the glasses, at the hand returning the handkerchief to the coat pocket, and in those eyes was something more dangerous than rage or grief recognition. The look of a man who had seen this before and had spent his entire career learning how to answer it. His right hand gripped the edge of the wooden bench until the knuckles turned bone white, the tendons rising beneath the skin like cables under tension, the wood creaking faintly under the pressure. Curtis, the maintenance worker who had moved from the back wall to the last row during the commotion, heard the creak. He looked at the man's hand, then at his face, then at the old man at the front of the courtroom, and in the jawline of both men in the particular architecture of cheekbone and brow, he saw something that made his own breath catch. But he said nothing. The man released the bench. The pressure left a faint impression in the wood, shallow, temporary, but enough to prove he had been there. He moved toward the aisle, and the people he passed did not look up, not because they didn't notice him, but because his presence carried a weight that made eye contact feel like trespass. He walked past the gallery, past the bailiff, past the clerk, and through the heavy oak doors at the back. He did not slam them. He caught the door with one hand as it closed, controlling even that small sound, and then he was gone. No one connected the two men. To the gallery, he was just a stranger who had seen enough and left. But Curtis saw. He saw the jawline. He saw the way the man's eyes had tracked the old man's handkerchief ritual with a focus that was not curiosity, but devotion. Outside, the afternoon sun spilled across the courthouse steps with the indifference of a universe that does not take sides. The man descended without pausing his shoes, hitting the concrete in a rhythm that was not hurried and not slow, but perfectly deliberately controlled the cadence of a man who had trained himself to move through crisis the way a surgeon moves through an operating room, with every step mapped and every motion serving a purpose the observer cannot see. He walked 3 blocks to a nondescript black sedan parked on a residential street. The car was clean, but unremarkable, registered to an address that existed only in a federal database. He slid behind the wheel and pulled the door shut with a click that sealed the interior into a pocket of silence so complete it felt like entering a different dimension. His hands were steady. His face was still. This was not the moment for calls or outbursts. This was the moment for something Wade Hargrave had never been trained to understand. Patience, precision, the methodical gathering of truth by a man who knew that truth properly assembled and deployed was more destructive than any weapon in any arsenal. He tapped the dashboard twice. A screen lit up running on a secure federal channel that bypassed public servers. He entered encrypted credentials without looking at the keyboard and pulled up the courthouse's internal camera feeds. Multiple angles, multiple timestamps, none of it scrubbed yet. He found the timestamp. Rewound. Watched. Angle 1. Wade's hand cutting sideways, the blur of motion impossible to misinterpret. Angle 2. Elijah's head snapping to the right, glasses tumbling, blood blooming from his lip. Angle 3, a close-up of Wade's face in the fraction of a second before the strike. And there it was. Not rage, not duty, pleasure. The slight widening of the pupils, the lift at the corners of the mouth, the relaxation of the muscles around the eyes that occurs when a human being is experiencing satisfaction. Wade had enjoyed it. The slap was not a loss of control, it was a reward. The man paused the footage on that frame. Then he reached for the earpiece clipped to the visor, placed it in his ear, and tapped twice. Activate behavioral surveillance on subject Wade Hargrave. Authorization Daniels Nathaniel. Level 6. Protocol Alpha 3. Confirmed. Authority Special Agent Nathaniel Daniels. Clearance verified. Protocol initiated. The line went dead. Nathaniel Daniels, son of Elijah, agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, watched the courthouse door through the windshield. After several minutes, his father emerged. Slow. Upright. Blood still on his glasses handkerchief in his pocket. The surveyor's diagram still in his hand because no one had asked to see it. Elijah descended the steps and walked toward the bus stop at the corner. Nathaniel did not step out of the car. He did not wave. He did not call his father's name. He sat behind the wheel and watched because in his world consequences were not about speed. They were about precision. He watched his father board the bus. He watched the bus pull away. Then he turned the key, not to leave, but to begin. Inside the courthouse, Wade cracked his knuckles and chuckled under his breath. He had no idea that the man he had not bothered to look at in the last row had just set into motion the kind of machinery that does not stop until the thing it was built to process has been ground into its component parts and held up to a light that no badge and no sealed file can survive. The house sat on the east end of Prospect Street 3rd from the corner on a block where every lawn told a story of pride maintained on a budget that required choices. Mow the grass or fix the porch step, paint the shutters or save for the property tax bill that arrived every November, like a letter from a creditor who would never stop writing. Elijah's house was modest and brick-built in 1953. The mortar had been repointed once, maybe 15 years ago, and was due again. The porch was concrete cracked in 2 places, but swept clean. The railing was wrought iron painted black every 3 years because Elijah believed that maintenance was a form of respect and neglect was a form of giving up. The porch light was off. It had been off since Ruth died because Ruth had always been the one to turn it on when evening came, and Elijah had not replaced the habit any more than he had replaced her chair at the dining table or her reading lamp on the side table. Some absences are maintained deliberately, not out of grief, but out of fidelity, because filling the spaces a person left behind is a kind of erasure. He once told a neighbor who offered to install a motion sensor light that a home doesn't need to shine, it just needs to hold. Nathaniel turned off the engine. The car ticked in the silence, metal contracting as it cooled, and for a moment, he sat with his eyes on the front door painted the same dark green it had been since before he left for college, since before his mother got sick. He stepped out into air that smelled of wood smoke and the damp earthiness of fallen leaves decomposing along the curb. He reached the door without knocking because the door was unlocked, the way it had always been unlocked for him and no one else. A fact that was never stated but always understood, like most of the important things between them. The interior was dim but not dark. Curtains draw on a single lamp in the far corner, casting warm amber light across the room. The lamp had a base shaped like a lighthouse, a souvenir from Cape Hatteras in 1987, the only vacation Nathaniel could remember that had not involved visiting relatives or attending a funeral. The smell of the house was specific and unchangeable. Old wood lemon polish, the leather of the Bible on the side table, and beneath all of that, the ghost of Ruth's perfume which had soaked into the curtains and the walls with such thoroughness that Nathaniel sometimes wondered whether the house itself was wearing it in her memory. He passed the shelves crowded with books arranged by subject, the photo albums with dates in Ruth's handwriting. Beside the bookshelf, on a small table with a doily, sat the old chessboard. Pieces frozen mid-game, a position Elijah had been playing against himself for 9 months, moving one side then the other, trying to be fair to both because Ruth had been his only opponent, and he could not bring himself to start a game she would never finish. Elijah was already seated at the small dining table, back straight, hands palm down on the surface. He did not look up when Nathaniel entered. Elijah opened a drawer and pulled out a photograph. Aged corners, curled edges, faded. A younger version of himself standing in a crowd on a sun-bleached sidewalk flanked by a black minister in a dark suit and a group of men and women holding handmade signs. 1965. Expressions, firm mouths, closed eyes forward. Peaceful protest as dangerous defiance. He placed the photograph on the table, not as a memory, as evidence. That wasn't the first slap, he said. His voice was low and level-worn like the porch boards, steady as the house that held them. There was one outside a voting booth in Selma. I was 22. A white man in a hat I never saw the face of. Open palm right across the mouth. I had ink on my finger from the ballot and blood on my chin before I made it back to the car. He paused. There was one outside Calvary Baptist the year your mother and I married. A police officer, different town, same kind of man. Called me boy in front of Ruth. She never forgot it. Neither did I. Nathaniel stood across the table, coat still on hands in his pockets. He did not sit. Sitting would have changed the geometry of the moment. And the ones you didn't tell me about, Nathaniel said. It was not a question. Elijah's eyes moved to the photograph, but his fingers did not touch it. Those were mine to carry. Every man gets to choose which bruises he shows and which ones he keeps folded up in his pocket. I took them all the same way. I took this one, Elijah said, and now his eyes lifted to meet his son's sharp and clear, no film of tears. Not because I'm soft, not because I couldn't fight back, but because I needed to stay on my feet. A man on the ground can't see what's coming. A man on his feet can. Nathaniel did not speak. His stillness was coiled potential energy held in check by discipline so practiced it had become invisible. You asked me once, Elijah said when you were 14, why I never fought back. I told you it was because violence only feeds itself. That was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth is that I always knew who I was fighting. Not the man in front of me. The thing behind him. The walls and floors and ceilings built to keep men like me looking up instead of forward. You can't punch a building down, son, but you can file the right papers until the building condemns itself. I don't want a headline, Elijah said. I don't want an apology. I want it to stop. I want you to make it stop. Nathaniel looked at his father for a long moment. Then he reached across the table, picked up the photograph, studied it not as a son, but as an investigator cataloging details for future use, and folded it carefully along a crease that had been folded before. He slid it into his coat pocket. Not as keepsake, as mission. Go to bed, Pop, he said. Elijah moved toward the hallway, then paused without turning around. Don't stay too long in the past. That's where they want you. Then he was gone, and Nathaniel stood alone in the amber light with a photograph in his coat and blood drying on glasses he had not been allowed to clean. He turned and left the house quietly, purposefully, carrying something heavier than a badge. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building in southeast Washington that had no name on the buzzer and no doorman in the lobby. Nathaniel had lived here for 6 years and had never introduced himself to a neighbor, not out of unfriendliness, but because the work he did required a life in which personal connections were controlled and kept to a minimum. The room where he worked was spare. A desk, a chair, a secure terminal whose screen was the only light source casting cold blue across his face. He entered the credentials that opened the layer of federal architecture most citizens did not know existed. He typed Wade Hargrave's name. The personnel file loaded in sections, each one a layer of institutional history peeled back to reveal diseased tissue. 9 formal complaints spanning 14 years. 9 separate incidents documented in language filled with passive constructions and qualifying phrases, and the strategic deployment of words like alleged and unsubstantiated that serve not as descriptions of fact but as instructions to stop looking. He read them the way a surgeon reads an X-ray scanning for the fractures that reveal not just the individual injury but the underlying condition that allowed it to occur. The first case was dated 6 years ago. Deshaun Avery, 19, a sophomore on an athletic scholarship for baseball, stopped for a broken taillight at 11:47 p.m. The body camera showed Deshaun standing beside the vehicle with his hands visible, saying, "Yes, sir," and "No, sir," with the practiced deference of a young black man taught by his mother exactly how to survive a traffic stop. The footage was clear for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Then it corrupted. The technical report attributed the corruption to a battery malfunction, a diagnosis supported by no diagnostic data, and contradicted by the fact that the camera had functioned perfectly for the preceding 97 minutes. When the footage resumed, Deshaun was on the ground. His right arm was bent at an angle that arms are not designed to bend, elbow dislocated radius fractured in 2 places. Hargrave's report used the phrase "suspect" became combative 3 times in 7 sentences. Deshaun lost his scholarship. The university's insurance would not cover the surgery because the injury occurred during what they classified as a criminal interaction. He was now 25, working night shifts at a warehouse, throwing arm permanently limited. Nathaniel highlighted the name in red. The second case, Keisha Odom, a registered nurse 41, stopped during a routine traffic check. Hargrave's body camera recorded his first words. "You know you like a man in uniform." Keisha's complaint described what happened next. Hargrave leaned into the window, placed his hand on her forearm, and when she pulled away, told her that pulling away could be classified as resistance. She sat still for the remaining 4 minutes, hands on the wheel, tears running down her face while Hargrave ran her plates and made comments about her appearance. Dismissed for insufficient evidence. Keisha changed her commute. 45 additional minutes each way to avoid his patrol zone. 390 hours a year. For 3 years. Red. The third case was different. Where the first 2 were marked unsubstantiated, this one carried a phrase that in federal law enforcement held specific and troubling weight: closed, external interference. A 23-year-old black man detained after a protest. 9-page handwritten complaint describing a night in custody that included verbal abuse, physical intimidation, and a racial slur carved into the wall of the holding cell, carved with what appeared to be a key or small blade. The file ended abruptly. No follow-up, no review. Just external interference. Someone with authority had reached into this file and closed it the way you close a coffin, with the intention that what was inside would never be seen again. Nathaniel clicked the security tab. High sensitivity file. Elevated clearance required. He entered his override code. The screen flickered and loaded. A redacted landscape. Names blacked out. Timestamps removed. But beneath the blackout lines, a fragment of a voice transcript. Wade Hargrave's words. "That little punk should have known better. I didn't break him. I bent him till he snapped himself." Cold, unhurried the cadence of a man bragging, not confessing. It confirmed what the files suggested. Wade Hargrave was not a man who lost control. He was a man who exercised it deliberately, repeatedly, with the full expectation that the walls around him would hold. He ran Hargrave's internal activity logs and found something damning. In 1 week alone, Hargrave had accessed 3 databases unrelated to patrol duties, a social services record, a hospital intake report, and a sealed juvenile file. Each access corresponded to a date within 2 weeks of a complaint being filed against him. He was gathering intelligence on his accusers, using the system designed to protect them as a tool for identifying their vulnerabilities. He cross-referenced the sealed case file's closure date with judicial activity logs and found 2 phone calls, both after midnight, both under 60 seconds, between Wade Hargrave's personal number and a number registered to a federal judge named Clement Ashford. 30 years on the bench. A reputation for being tough on crime that had hardened into fact the way a lie repeated often enough becomes indistinguishable from truth. Nathaniel downloaded the metadata. Timestamps, login IDs, revision authors, all encrypted. But he knew how to unmask them when the time came. He stared at the word closed on the sealed file, as if willing it to bleed. The message arrived at 2:17 in the morning. Encrypted, routed through 3 internal proxies, stripped of its sender's identity. 4 sentences. You are building a case against a decorated police officer based on an incident involving your own father. Every review board in the country will call this personal. Your clearance, your pension, your 18 years, all of it becomes collateral the moment this goes formal. Think carefully about what you're willing to lose. Nathaniel read it twice, wanting to feel the full weight. 18 years. Cases built and closed mornings that began with credentials and evenings that ended with reports, a life structured around the belief that the law properly applied was the only tool capable of reshaping a world bent out of alignment by the very hands entrusted with its maintenance. He opened the desk drawer. Beneath classified briefing folders was a piece of paper, folded and refolded so many times the creases had turned white. A drawing in crayon by a child now 22 and studying pre-law at Howard University. A stick figure in a dark suit, arms outstretched, standing between 2 smaller figures, and something large and shapeless colored in black. Beneath it, in the unsteady capitals of a 6-year-old, Daddy Catches Bad Guys, his daughter Aisha. She had drawn it the day he missed her first-grade recital because a case had gone critical. She was 22 now. She still did not know what his work really cost. He looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he folded it along its well-worn creases, placed it back in the drawer, and closed the warning message without replying. He returned to Wade Hargrave's file and continued working. The decision was made not through announcement, but through continuation, the way a river makes its decision at a fork, not by choosing, but by following the slope of the ground beneath it. The gas station sat at the edge of the county line like something the highway had forgotten. Gasway 13-mile marker 274. Pump's dead canopy sagging a faded neon open that flickered like it was trying to remember its purpose. The parking lot was cracked asphalt colonized by weeds. She was already there, seated on the concrete step beside a dead vending machine hoodie, pulled low legs, drawn up arms around her knees. In her old personnel photograph, she had been standing straight, shoulders squared, wearing the expression of a woman who believed the institution she had joined was capable of correction. The woman on the concrete step did not look like that photograph. She looked like what happens to that belief after 7 years of evidence. They did not shake hands. "You came alone," she said. Her voice was husky from disuse, the sound of a throat that had spent too long swallowing words. "I always do." She pulled out a USB drive, small, scratched, wrapped in black tape. "This is the only copy." I wiped my drive. Ghost Fee, PN. Smashed the laptop. If I get audited, I was never here. Nathaniel took it without touching her hand. "They buried my complaint," she said. He laughed about it in the elevator the next day. Said, "Ain't nobody coming for me. I'm the dog they let off the leash." The audio was rough, recorded in what sounded like a break room. A laugh came first, dry and smug. Then Wade's voice, slow and savoring. I just nudged him. "One kick that weak ass, folded like a lawn chair. If he died, that's on him. I don't kill people. I just remind them they ain't built for this world." Then the sentence that connected Wade to his protector, Ashford, always covers for me. I drop names, he drops hammers. That's our game. "Why now?" Nathaniel asked. "Because I saw the video. Everyone saw it." She paused. "But I watched you. In the back row. You didn't flinch. Everyone else did. even the judge. But not you. You weren't shocked. You were waiting. Like it wasn't new. It was. You're not like the others. They file reports and wait for permission. You're not asking anyone to say yes. I don't need yes. I need proof. You've got it. But this won't bring him down alone. They'll call it locker room talk. Then I'll give them enough bodies to match the stench. She stood. You never asked my name. I already know it. Then use it only if I disappear. She walked toward the tree line without looking back. Nathaniel returned to the car and synced the USB. As the file uploaded, his secure terminal chimed. Someone had attempted to access and delete files from Wade's complaint history. The attempt was logged 47 minutes ago, originating from the Winston Hill Precinct's administrative office. Someone knew he was looking and was trying to clean up. He worked fast. Submitted the audio under priority review with a classification code fewer than 200 people had clearance to use. The system confirmed risk level escalated to level orange. Orange was not red, but it was one shade away. The room was 30 feet below street level. No windows. One door. A conference table engineered to absorb sound so that words spoken here stayed here. Nathaniel arrived first. He placed the recorder on the table and pressed the button that activated the red light. Judge Clement Ashford arrived exactly on time. Tall, narrow through the shoulders, dressed in a suit so precisely tailored it appeared grown onto his body. His tie was burgundy, knotted in a full Windsor pulled tight against his collar with pressure that seemed to hold more than silk in place. His eyes were a gray so neutral they seemed designed to reflect whatever was projected onto them without revealing anything of their own. "Agent Daniels," he said, setting his briefcase down with a leather snap. "I understand there has been some misunderstanding." Nathaniel did not stand. "Sit down, Judge." He slid a printed transcript across the table. 2 calls. Both to your personal number. Both from Wade Hargrave. Both after midnight. Both within 72 hours of a misconduct complaint being closed. One of those complaints involved a young man held overnight in a cell where a racial slur was carved into the wall. The file was sealed under a classification that requires judicial authorization. Your authorization. I receive hundreds of calls. Are we assuming guilt by association? No. Nathaniel pressed play. Wade's voice filled the room. Ashford always covers for me. I drop names, he drops hammers. That's our game. Ashford reached for the transcript. His hands were steady, almost theatrically so. He scanned the page and chuckled brittle. Hardly admissible. Locker room talk from a deluded subordinate. No one is talking about arresting you. Not yet. Then what is this, an intimidation stunt? You're sitting across from a federal judge. I'm sitting across from a man who left a door unlocked for a predator. And now I'm asking why. Ashford's composure cracked, not shattered, but hairline fractures forming beneath a surface that everyone in the room knew would not hold. I didn't tell him to break the law. No, you just made sure no one could prove it when he did. You didn't get your hands dirty. You just made sure there was a towel waiting when his hands were covered in blood. Ashford stood, color draining. You don't understand how this works, Daniels. Men like Hargrave are necessary. Men who aren't afraid to do the hard things. Hard things don't include crushing spines and laughing over broken bodies. That's not courage. That's rot. And you made space for it to grow. Ashford picked up his briefcase. You'll regret this, Agent Daniels. Men like you burn bright, but you don't last. Men like me don't need to last. We just need to burn long enough to reveal what's crawling underneath. Ashford left. His steps fast, but controlled the stride of a man who knows the spotlight is behind him and the shadow is catching up. Thomas Leard, the chief federal inspector, stepped out from the observation room. We've got him. Nathaniel turned off the recorder and walked out. He's the first crack, not the last. The Federal Criminal Prosecution Office occupied the 7th floor of a building whose address was known to fewer people than the number of floors it contained. The Assistant District Attorney, Sandra Chen Watkins, looked at the file Nathaniel placed on her desk the way a surgeon looks at the X-ray that will determine the next 6 hours of her life. Wade Hargrave, 14 years, 9 complaints, 3 ethics investigations, 1 sealed file with external interference, and Judge Clement Ashford as the seal. The judge made the cage. Hargrave was the animal inside it. She scanned the evidence index audio recordings, phone logs, suppressed complaints, judicial contact records, the voice transcript, the call logs. Each piece cataloged, time-stamped, cross-referenced. This requires Level 1 clearance. Your name will be permanently attached. There is no walking this back. Nathaniel produced the digital clearance token. I've been ready since the moment he called my father garbage. The system verified him in under 7 seconds. The screen pulsed green. Sandra pulled up the template for a Title 18 violation abuse of authority under federal color of law. The charges entered clean and surgical. Aggravated use of force, coercion of testimony, evidence suppression, conspiracy to obstruct justice, complicity by the judiciary. The system prompted arrest warrant authorization required. Nathaniel picked up the pen and signed. The signature landed. Not loud, but irreversible. Ink against paper. Legacy against rot. Sandra sealed the document. You're signing the fall of someone the institution has been protecting for over a decade. This isn't a choice, Nathaniel said. It's overdue. The warrant specified to be taken into federal custody without notification to local precinct. High-risk profile. No warning required. The video was 38 seconds long shot on a phone held at an angle that suggested the person recording was trying to be invisible. It was not professional. It was not steady. It was in every technical sense a terrible piece of video. It was also the most important 38 seconds recorded in America that year. Shonda Williams had not intended to become the person who changed the national conversation. She had intended to sit quietly in the gallery and wait for her custody hearing. But when Wade's hand connected with Elijah's face, her hand moved before her mind could calculate the risk. She raised her phone, pressed record, and held it just high enough while her other arm pulled her son tighter against her chest. She uploaded the video that evening from the parking lot of the McDonald's on Route 9, sitting in her car with the engine running and her son asleep in the car seat using the restaurant's free Wi-Fi because her own data plan had been throttled. She posted it with no caption, no hashtag, just the video. By 9:43 the next morning, it had been shared 4,000 times. By noon, it was everywhere. But the moment that turned a viral video into a cultural event happened at 2:17 in the morning in an apartment in Atlanta where a 22-year-old nursing student named Desiree Coleman sat cross-legged on her bed with tears running down her face. Desiree had been stopped by police once when she was 17 for driving her mother's Camry through a subdivision a patrol officer had decided did not match the car or the driver. Her mother had been on the phone the entire encounter, listening through the speaker, telling Desiree to comply to say yes, sir, to keep her hands visible to survive. Desiree had survived. She had gone to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and cried the particular tears of a young woman who has just learned that her body in certain spaces is treated as evidence of a crime she has not committed. She watched Shonda's video 3 times. The 3rd time, she opened her own camera. "This is my grandfather," she said, even though Elijah was not her grandfather. "This is everyone's grandfather. This is the man who raised us and fed us and stood in line to vote when they didn't want him to. And this cop put his hand across this man's face like he was swatting a fly. Like 74 years of living didn't matter, like we don't matter. Within 18 hours, 4 million views. The image that defined the moment was a still frame on the left. Wade frozen mid-swing, face contorted with contempt. On the right, Elijah blood on his glasses, back straight eyes looking not at Wade, but through him. Caption: "He didn't flinch, but you should have." One comment buried under thousands got screenshotted and turned into a movement. He didn't scream, but his son could make the entire system scream back. 5 million likes. Nathaniel was not named, but the algorithm didn't need names. Inside the FBI's media monitoring system, Wade's name triggered 70,000 mentions in under 18 hours. Sentiment 92% negative. Congressional aides were drafting statements. Internal affairs divisions in 3 states reopened shelved files not from duty, but from pressure that had become impossible to ignore. Wade's social media went dark, but silence on the internet is not a strategy. It is an invitation. The press conference was not scheduled, not authorized. Wade stood behind a podium someone had dragged from a storage room addressing reporters with a jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched visibly, and eyes burning with fury he no longer had the infrastructure to contain. This isn't about justice. This is a coordinated campaign against law enforcement, against white officers doing their jobs. From the back of the crowd, a voice. You slapped a 74-year-old man. Wade heard it. You weren't in that courtroom. You didn't see the threat. Every word was a shovel. Wade was digging with speed and enthusiasm that suggested he had no idea how deep the hole already was. In the FBI's media wing, Nathaniel watched the live stream behind tinted glass. A junior agent asked, "Should we respond?" Nathaniel said nothing. That evening, CNN's broadcast opened with a red banner. Federal email suggests imminent FBI action against Officer Hargrave. A fragment of a coordination email FBI will move on Hargrave. Pre-dawn. Federal scope. No postponement. Their coming at dawn became a digital rallying cry. Inside his home, Wade saw the broadcast live. He reached for his phone. Judge Ashford's number disconnected. His lawyer voicemail. The precinct no answer. His phone hit the far wall screen, shattering battery ejecting. Silence swallowed the room. He stood in his kitchen chest, heaving. The framed commendations on the wall looked smaller now. The thin blue line flag above the liquor cabinet hung limp and dusty. He poured bourbon into a glass that was not clean. Drank standing up. Then his eyes fell on the refrigerator door, where a photograph was held by a magnet shaped like a police badge. The photograph was old, sun-faded, showing a boy of maybe 5 sitting on the shoulders of a man in uniform, both grinning, the man's hand resting on the boy's knee with a grip that was protective and possessive in equal measure. The man was Wade's father. Harold Hargrave, 22 years on the force, dead of a stroke at 59, buried in a cemetery where the headstone read, "He served." Wade had been 12. He had worn his father's badge to the funeral pinned to a suit jacket 3 sizes too big, and no one had told him to take it off. No one ever had. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked away because the boy in the picture and the man in the kitchen were the same person, and neither of them had ever learned the difference between serving and controlling, between order and domination, between the badge and the wound it was meant to cover. On the table, the federal summons sat unopened. Printed on paper, the color of old blood. Non-deferrable. Immediate compliance required. He looked out the window at a dimming sky. Tomorrow had a time. Tomorrow had a face. And that face belonged to the son of the man he slapped. Dawn arrived with discipline, not with fanfare. Just the slow replacement of darkness by a gray so flat it looked less like light than the absence of the last excuse for hiding. No birds, no breeze, just engines idling at the end of a residential street. The convoy was 5 vehicles deep. 3 black SUVs, 1 tactical van, 1 transport vehicle with reinforced doors. They moved at the exact pace of inevitability. Wade stepped outside at 6:12 a.m., unshaved, shirt half-buttoned. He lit a cigarette with the forced casualness of a man performing normalcy for an audience that has already left the theater. He heard the boots before he saw the faces, a dozen sets moving in unison. He turned slowly at first, then lurching when the metallic slide of a bolt carrier screamed across the air. From the center of the line, Nathaniel emerged. No helmet, no tactical gear, just the black FBI jacket over a white shirt, gold letters catching the flat gray light. "You can't do this. I'll sue all of you." Nathaniel raised the document. "I can. I do. And I signed it." Wade stepped forward too fast. The first agent restrained him. Steel cuffs wrapped around his wrists with a double click that was quiet but final. "This is revenge," Wade snarled. "You're doing this for your father." Nathaniel stepped close, voice like a scalpel. "This is for everyone who didn't get to speak." The back door of the transport opened. Wade was guided inside. The door slammed. Through the reinforced glass, his face was visible for a moment, a white blur. Then the vehicle pulled away. At the end of the block, a boy of maybe 8 straddled a bicycle, a carton of milk balanced on the handlebars sent by his mother to the corner store. He held perfectly still, one sneaker on the curb, watching the convoy of black vehicles disappear around the corner, his mouth slightly open, the milk warming in the morning air. He did not understand what he had seen, but he would remember the boots, the sound of them moving together, and the silence they left behind for the rest of his life. Nathaniel stood at the curb. No celebration, no vindication, just the cold clarity of progress. 8 feet by 10 feet. Beige walls, recessed lighting, a steel table bolted to the floor. The camera blinked red at intervals so regular they functioned as a metronome. Wade sat cuffed to the table, posture rigid, jaw up, performing defiance. But his eyes moved too much, scanning the room, the walls, the empty chair, the door. Nathaniel entered alone. Sat down, placed a closed folder on the table, did not open it. Wade broke the silence first. "No attorney. Thought you feds were big on due process. You waived representation. You signed the form. I like a fair fight." Nathaniel tapped the screen. Body cam footage, a nighttime arrest, a man stumbling. Wade's voice. "Keep crawling. Maybe you'll learn something." Edited. Second clip. A woman sobbing. Wade's voice. "We can do this easy or we can do this forever." Within protocol. Third clip. Keisha Odom's testimony. The traffic stop. The words. The touch. 3 years of detours. Wade shrugged. She exaggerated. Nathaniel tapped again. The fourth image was not a video. It was a drawing. Crayon on white paper lines, unsteady and proportions wrong in the way children's drawings always are. 2 figures. One large, colored in blue with a shape on its chest that might have been a badge. The other small, drawn in brown with circles for glasses and a line for a cane. Between them, jagged red lines. And beneath, in careful, wobbly capitals, "Don't let them hurt Grandpa." A 7-year-old named Caleb who lived 3 doors from Elijah and had watched the courtroom footage on his mother's phone because she had been crying and he wanted to understand why. Wade stared at the drawing. His smirk did not return. His jaw worked, clenching and releasing. A child drew that Nathaniel said voice quiet, not soft. Quiet. A 7-year-old who has never been inside a courtroom, who has never met you. And this is what you put into the world. Wade stood, chair screeching, arms jerking against cuffs. "This isn't how this works. You don't get to be the judge. I'm not the judge. I'm the consequence." The room did not shake. But Wade did. His legs failed. He dropped back into the chair. His hands cuffed to the table opened and closed around nothing. Behind the glass, agents watched in silence. No one wrote notes. They simply watched a structure they once believed was permanent begin to come apart at the joints. The trial was assigned to the federal courthouse in Richmond marble floors. High ceilings, the kind of silence that only stone walls can produce. The gallery was full. Not just reporters and legal observers, but people who had driven from other states, other versions of the same story who needed to be present the way mourners need to be present at a funeral, not for the dead, but for themselves. Wade sat at the defendant's table in state-issued gray. No badge, no belt, no nameplate. The posture that once communicated power now communicated stubbornness. The posture of a man holding a shape because he has forgotten how to hold anything else. The prosecution called its next witness. The people call Elijah Amos Daniels. The double doors opened. Not dramatically. They opened the way all doors open, with a click and a swing, and through them walked a man who had been born in a country that considered his body property, raised in a country that considered his presence a provocation, and who had arrived at 74 with his spine intact and his dignity unbroken, and his reading glasses still carrying a drop of dried blood on the right lens that he had never cleaned. The courtroom rose. It was not coordinated. No one gave a signal. It began with one person, an elderly black woman in the third row, who pushed herself upright despite arthritic knees, and then another and another, until every person was standing, and the only sound was the collective whisper of fabric and breath and the particular quality of silence that occurs when people understand the moment is larger than any individual within it. Even the bailiff stood. Even the stenographer paused and rose. Elijah walked to the witness stand, one hand on the railing, not for support but for contact. The clerk administered the oath. "I do," he said, and his voice carried with the clarity of something distilled by time, all excess removed, all performance stripped. The prosecutor established the facts. Then she paused. "Mr. Daniels, for the record, could you tell the court about your immediate family?" "I have one son. His name is Nathaniel Daniels." "And what is your son's occupation?" "He is a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." "And is your son present in this courtroom today?" "He is." Every head turned. The movement was simultaneous, a collective rotation sweeping the gallery, the press box, and the jury, all searching for the face and finding it in the fourth row. Nathaniel Daniels, dark suit, white shirt, hands folded, expression unchanged. Wade's color drained in a visible tide from forehead through cheeks to jaw until he was the color of the suit he was wearing. His mouth opened. His eyes went wide whites, visible all the way around. The old man he slapped and the federal agent who destroyed his world were father and son. He half rose. "That old bastard, he's the reason I'm here. This whole thing, it's a setup." The judge slammed the gavel. The defendant will remain silent, but the damage was done. The jury saw his face. The cameras caught it. The gallery heard it. Not a defense. Not a denial. A confirmation that Wade did not see a victim when he looked at Elijah. He saw the source of his own destruction. Elijah did not react. He sat with his hands folded and his back straight and his blood-marked glasses positioned on his nose with the same careful precision with which he positioned everything in his life. "Mr. Daniels, did you provoke Officer Hargrave?" "No, ma'am. What were you doing when he approached you?" "Standing. What happened when he struck you?" A pause. I stood, and I adjusted my collar. "Do you consider the force excessive?" Elijah looked at the prosecutor, then turned his gaze toward Wade. "Not dramatic, not theatrical. A man looking at another man with the full weight of 74 years of experience in being looked at by men who believed they had the right to diminish him. He found not anger, not triumph, but something deeper settling on a word that would echo through the trial record and the national conversation for months. "I consider it unnecessary," Elijah said. "And unworthy." The word hung in the air. Unworthy, not illegal, not excessive. A moral judgment delivered by a man who had earned the right to deliver it through the simple, devastating fact of having survived what the man across the room had done to him and refusing to be diminished by it. Wade's attorney attempted cross-examination. 11 minutes. Accomplished nothing. "Did you insult Officer Rollins?" "Numb. I didn't open my mouth." "Did you resist?" I blinked. As Elijah stepped down, the courtroom rose again. And as he passed Nathaniel's row, the two men exchanged a look brief and complete, containing everything that had passed between them since the evening on the porch, when Elijah placed the photograph on the table and said, "I want you to make it stop." The look said it stopped. Officer Tanya Rhodes entered next, late 20s, black, wearing a dark blue dress chosen with care. She had served under Wade for 3 years and had come to do something she had been told she should never do, tell the truth. "Did you witness Lieutenant Hargrave use force you considered unauthorized?" "Yes." How many times I stopped counting after the first year? Did you report it? Her hands tightened. Once. I was called into my sergeant's office the next morning. He said, "Don't make waves if you want to make detective." And what did you do? I stopped making waves. Then, he didn't need to tell us the rules didn't apply to him. We saw it every day. She looked directly at Wade as she said it. For the first time, he could not meet someone's eyes. Keisha Odom walked to the stand with the care of a woman who had spent 3 years rerouting her life around one man. She described the stop, the words, the touch, the tears, the detours. Her voice did not break, but her hands shook the entire time. 390 hours a year, the prosecutor said. For 3 years. 1,170 hours. That's how much of my life he took. Not with a slap, with fear. Desiree Coleman testified last, not as a legal witness, but as a character witness for community impact. She spoke simply about her grandmother, the traffic stop at 17, the video at 2 a.m. About the phrase, "This is everyone's grandfather," and the fact that it was true, not literally, but in the way that matters most. After her testimony, she walked out of the courtroom and sat on the limestone steps in the late morning sun. She pulled out her phone and called her grandmother. The phone rang 3 times. "Baby." "How'd it go? I was scared, Grandma." A pause on the line. "Were you? But that old man, the one they hit? He was scared too. And he still stood up." Her grandmother was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that carries decades of understanding. "Then you're grown now, baby. That's what grown is." Desiree hung up and sat on the steps for a while longer, watching people come and go through the courthouse doors, some carrying briefcases, some carrying nothing but the weight of what they had just witnessed. And she felt something settle inside her that had been unsettled since she was 17 years old, and a man with a badge made her feel like a criminal for driving her mother's car. Back inside, Wade sat at the defendant's table with his shoulders sagging and his jaw unclenched for the first time since the trial began. The rigidity was gone, replaced by a slump that was not relaxation, but surrender. The judge's voice was firm, not loud, just firm the way the ground is firm. "Wade Edward Hargrave, this court finds you guilty on all counts. Obstruction of justice, abuse of power, excessive use of force under color of law, violation of civil rights resulting in bodily harm. For these crimes, you are sentenced to 22 years in a federal correctional facility. There will be no parole, no cheer, no gasp." The words settled the way sediment settles in still water. In the same session, Judge Clement Ashford removed from the bench, facing corruption charges. 30 years reframed as 30 years of complicity. After the session, a precinct commander approached Officer Tanya Rhodes. "We're building a new internal oversight unit. I've read your testimony. I'd like you to lead it." Tanya looked at his hand, then his face. She shook it once firmly. "Yes." Nathaniel was not in the courtroom for sentencing. His presence would have converted the story into something it was not. He was photographed once, standing on the sidewalk across the street at 9:04 a.m., dark suit expression, unreadable gaze directed at the windows. The photograph was published without a caption. An editor added one, "The man who returned justice to its rightful shape." Wade was processed at a federal facility. Badge replaced by barcode, name replaced by number. When he tried to make conversation with escorting agents, no one responded. His voice fell into sterile air like a coin into an empty well. Within weeks, mandatory audit trails adopted in 4 states. Evidence management systems updated with flags that could not be disabled. A nonprofit formed called No More Closures, dedicated to digitizing complaint records and providing free legal navigation. Its first seminar opened with a slide, "Silence isn't neutral, it's permission." The porch faced west, which meant that on clear evenings the sun descended directly into their line of sight, bleeding gold and copper across the sky in bands so vivid they looked painted. The rocking chairs sat side by side, separated by a small cedar table, Elijah had built himself, sanded smooth and sealed with 3 coats of marine varnish because he believed that anything worth building was worth protecting from the weather. Nathaniel sat in the chair on the left, Elijah on the right. Between them on the cedar table an envelope. The handwriting on the front lurched upward at the ends of words and dipped in the middles. The handwriting of a child still discovering that written language is a physical skill. Inside was a sheet of lined paper torn from a composition notebook. Blue crayon, large, carefully formed letters. Dear Mr. Nathaniel, my name is Caleb. I am 7. My mom showed me the video. She said you are a man of justice. I don't know what that means yet, but I know I want to be like you. Only I won't hit people, I promise. Love, Caleb. Beneath the words, a drawing, a stick figure in a dark suit with a yellow star on its chest, standing next to smaller figures, and above all of them, a wobbly yellow sun. Nathaniel had read the letter 3 times. Not because the words were difficult. They were the clearest words he had read in months. Clearer than depositions, clearer than judicial opinions, clearer than encrypted communications. Each reading disarmed him in a way that courtrooms and confessions had never managed. Reaching past the agent and the strategist to the part of him that was still a man who had once been a boy, who had once drawn pictures of his father in crayon, who had once believed that justice meant something simple and clean and true. Elijah had scanned the crayon words with an expression that was neither smile nor sorrow, but something between a weathered recognition that the world was still capable of producing a 7-year-old who would write, I promise, and mean it more than any oath sworn on a Bible in a courtroom. They had not spoken since. The rocking chairs moved at different tempos, and the silence between them was full the way a rest in music is full. You didn't tell them, Elijah said finally. In the hearing, you didn't tell them about the nights you sat with his file open for hours, how many doors you knocked on that didn't open. I didn't need applause. I needed clarity. And did you get it? No. A beat. I gave it. A flicker crossed Elijah's face. Not pride, a word too small. He offered something rarer. You didn't take revenge. You did something far harder. What's harder than justice? Correction, Elijah said. Revenge demands anger. Justice demands proof. But correction that demands restraint. And patience. And pain. Nathaniel looked at the third rocking chair, his mother's chair, empty for 3 years. Cushion faded fabric worn thin where Ruth had sat every evening for decades. Elijah had not moved it, had not replaced the cushion, had not draped it or repurposed it. In that exactness, the chair had become not empty, but complete. Elijah reached into his coat pocket and placed the handkerchief on the table between them. The white cloth with Ruth's embroidered initials beside the crayon letter, the 2 objects in the amber light, the past and the future, the wound and the promise. The boy spelled promise wrong. Elijah said quietly and meant it more than any court ever could. Nathaniel looked at his father, at the handkerchief, at the letter, at the chair that was occupied by absence, the way a frame is occupied by the painting it holds. I used to think justice meant closure, Nathaniel said, his voice barely above a breath. Now I think it just means no one else has to carry the weight. Elijah nodded, not in agreement, in recognition. And if they do, then we do this again. No drama, no declaration. Just a quiet promise in the half-light between 2 men who knew what cost looked like and had decided separately and together that the cost was worth paying as many times as it needed to be paid. Next morning, the porch chair sat empty in a way that felt different, not abandoned, unnecessary. The conversation had been held, the promise made, the weight acknowledged and distributed. Elijah had folded Caleb's letter neatly and placed it on the mantel inside. It sat between the 1965 photograph still curled at the edges and the white handkerchief with Ruth's initials pressed and placed with care. 3 objects from 3 generations. A knock came at the door. Quiet. Not the knock of a reporter or process server. the knock of someone small whose knuckles barely reached the knocker. Elijah opened the door and looked down. A girl, 10, maybe 11, blonde hair and a ponytail, pale freckles across her nose, holding a sketchbook pressed against her chest like a shield and a courage that didn't fit her size. She opened it to a page near the middle. A pencil drawing of a figure in a dark suit with a badge in one hand and an open palm, not a fist, in the other. The posture unmistakable, straight spine, level shoulders. "I want to be like him," she said, "but I won't need to hit anyone." Elijah looked at the drawing. He looked at the girl. He did not smile. He did not need to. He simply nodded once, the same deliberate motion he had used 10,000 times, a nod that was not agreement, but acknowledgement. "Good," he said. "Start there." The girl closed her sketchbook, tucked it against her chest, and walked down the porch steps without looking back because she did not need praise. She had already seen what it looked like to do the right thing when no one was cheering, and she had decided completely and without reservation that she would carry that image into whatever came next. Outside, the wind picked up. Leaves swirled around the porch where the girl had stood, catching the morning light as they spun. The sun hit the old boards at the angle only early morning achieves, casting the shadow of the empty rocking chair long and defined across the floorboards, a shadow that looked like someone had just stood up and walked inside, or like someone had been sitting there all along. On the mantel, 3 objects sat together. The photograph from 1965 showing a young man standing in a crowd that believed the world could change. The white handkerchief with the initials R.D., carrying the faint memory of blood, washed away but not forgotten. And the letter written in blue crayon by a boy who spelled promise with 1 S and meant it with his whole heart. Legacy doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it's the absence of what used to be broken. Sometimes it's a chair that no one needs to sit in anymore. And sometimes it's a 7-year-old boy who writes "I promise" in blue crayon and means it more than any verdict ever could. If you saw someone being struck in a courtroom and no one moved, would you be the one to stand up? Or would you be the one to look away? Tell us in the comments. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you know, someone you love, or someone you've been, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Every voice matters, especially the quiet ones.